In 1964, a small team at Pontiac broke one of General Motors' own rules and accidentally invented an entire kind of car. Within 4 years, Pontiac was the third best-selling car brand in the United States, building more than 910,000 cars in a single year. Its slogan wasn't about reliability or value or fuel economy. It was 3 words: we build excitement. And then, on a winter morning in 2010, a plain white sedan rolled off a line in Michigan. No crowd, no fanfare. It was the last Pontiac ever built, the final car from an 84-year-old American brand. This is the story of how the company that taught America to want excitement ended up building its own last car. And the strangest part is this: Pontiac didn't fade because nobody wanted it. It faded because the company that owned it slowly took away the one thing that made it Pontiac. To understand the end, you have to start with the rule that was broken to begin it. By the early 1960s, General Motors had a strict internal limit. Its smaller mid-size cars were not allowed to have big, powerful engines. It kept the divisions in their lanes and protected the expensive models at the top. Pontiac's chief engineer, a sharp, rebellious young man named John DeLorean, thought the rule was nonsense. So he and his team did something quietly outrageous. They took Pontiac's big 389 cubic inch V8, an engine meant for the heavy, full-size cars, and bolted it into a lighter mid-size body called the Tempest. Then, to get it past the executives, they didn't launch it as a new model at all. They buried it as a $300 option package. No board approval required. They needed a name with attitude, and they stole one from the most exotic place imaginable: Ferrari. They called it the GTO. Pontiac's own management expected to sell maybe 5,000 of them. They figured wrong. In its first year, 1964, the GTO sold over 32,000. Because DeLorean's team had discovered something nobody at GM had priced in. Young America didn't want sensible. It wanted speed it could actually afford. A big engine in a cheap, light car was a formula for raw, intoxicating acceleration, and Pontiac had just put it on the menu for the price of an option box. Every other car maker scrambled to copy it. The muscle car was born, and Pontiac was its father. Then came the Firebird. Then the Trans Am, with that screaming bird painted across the hood. For a brand that had been GM's forgettable middle child just a decade earlier, this was a complete reinvention. Pontiac was no longer the safe choice. It was the exciting one, and excitement, it turned out, sold. Here is how big it got. For nearly a decade, every single year from 1962 through 1970, Pontiac was the third best-selling car brand in the entire United States, behind only Chevrolet and Ford. In 1968, the division set an all-time record: more than 910,000 cars built in 1 year. Pontiac alone made up around 17% of every vehicle General Motors sold in America. Think about that. A brand that started life in 1926 as a cheap companion to a dying marque called Oakland had grown so strong it swallowed its parent and become one of the pillars of the largest company on Earth. Pontiac wasn't just profitable, it was cool, and it was making GM enormous amounts of money being cool. This was the peak, the view from the top. And from here, almost everything that made Pontiac special would slowly be taken away, not by a rival, but by the company that owned it. The 1970s arrived like a cold front. First came tighter emissions and safety regulations, which strangled the big, free-breathing V8s that were Pontiac's entire personality. Then insurance companies, alarmed by how fast these muscle cars were, raised premiums until a young buyer simply couldn't afford to insure one. Then, in 1973, the oil crisis hit, and suddenly a thirsty performance car looked less like a dream and more like a mistake. The muscle car era didn't end in a crash. It was quietly regulated and priced out of existence. By 1972, Pontiac had slipped out of third place, and it would never permanently climb back. The engines got smaller, the cars got heavier with safety equipment, the horsepower numbers, once a badge of honor, collapsed. Pontiac's whole identity had been built on excitement, and the 70s had made excitement illegal, expensive, and unfashionable all at once. But Pontiac wasn't finished. Not yet. In the early 1980s, the brand made a bold bet. Instead of pretending to be sensible, it would double down on the one thing it was famous for. The marketing department rolled out a tagline that would define the decade: "We build excitement," with rock and roll ads and bright lights. And for a while, it worked. The black and gold Trans Am became a movie star, roaring across the screen and selling on image alone. By 1988, Pontiac had clawed its way back to third in US sales. The boldest swing was a tiny two-seat sports car called the Fiero, a mid-engine commuter that looked like an exotic at a fraction of the price. It should have been the brand's rebirth. Instead, it became a warning. Early Fieros had a serious flaw. The four-cylinder engines were prone to catching fire. By the end of 1985, GM had logged over 100 reports of engine fires. The company was eventually forced to recall every single 1984 model. And in 1988, just as engineers had finally fixed the car and made it genuinely good, GM ended it. It was a pattern that would repeat for the rest of Pontiac's life. A flash of the old brilliance, undercut by corners that had been cut to save money. Because behind the scenes, General Motors had quietly changed how it built cars, and it would hollow Pontiac out from the inside. To cut costs, GM increasingly built one basic car and sold it across multiple divisions, changing little more than the badges and the grille. It's called badge engineering. A Pontiac, a Chevrolet, and a Buick might now be nearly the same vehicle wearing different costumes. It saved billions. It also quietly destroyed the entire reason Pontiac existed. Because if a Pontiac was just a Chevrolet with a different nose, why pay for the Pontiac? The brand that once meant a rule-breaking engineer dropping a forbidden V8 into a light body now meant a corporate parts bin car with some extra plastic body cladding bolted on. The excitement was a sticker now, and the symbol of how far it had fallen arrived in 2001. The Pontiac Aztek, a misshapen crossover built on a minivan floor that became a national punchline. The Aztek didn't end Pontiac on its own, but it was the perfect snapshot of a brand that had forgotten what it was for. Pontiac had spent decades being drained of its identity, one cost-saving decision at a time. Now the tank was nearly empty, and then the whole company ran out of road. In 2008, the financial crisis hit, and General Motors, too big, too slow, with too many overlapping brands, began burning through cash at a terrifying rate. The company that had once seemed untouchable was, within months, staring at collapse. It survived only because the government stepped in with a rescue that would ultimately run into the tens of billions of dollars. But the bailout came with hard conditions. GM was forced to file for bankruptcy reorganization in June 2009 and to shrink dramatically. It had too many brands competing with each other for the same shrinking sales. Some of them had to go. GM made its choice on April 27, 2009. Chevrolet, Buick, GMC, and Cadillac would survive. Saturn, Hummer, Saab, and Pontiac would not. The brand that had invented the muscle car, that had been America's number 3 for a decade, that had literally built excitement, was now a line item to be cut to save the rest. Tens of thousands of jobs went with the decision. The brand didn't fade because people stopped loving it. It was switched off in a boardroom to keep the larger company alive. The end itself was almost unbearably quiet. On January 4, 2010, the last Pontiac ever built, a plain white G6 sedan, a car most people couldn't pick out of a parking lot, rolled off the assembly line in Orion Township, Michigan. No screaming bird on the hood, no forbidden V8. Just a beige, sensible, badge-engineered four-door, the exact opposite of everything Pontiac had once stood for. On October 31, 2010, the final dealer agreements expired, and after 84 years, Pontiac officially ceased to exist. Think about the distance between those two cars. At the start, a young engineer breaking the rules to smuggle a giant engine into a cheap body, naming it after a Ferrari, lighting a fire under the entire industry. At the end, a forgettable white sedan, built to a budget, switched off by committee. That distance is the story. Pontiac didn't lose to Ford, or to the Japanese, or to the electric car. It was slowly stripped of the one thing it had, excitement, by the company that owned it, until there was nothing left worth saving. So what really happened to Pontiac? It made General Motors a fortune by being brave. It invented a kind of car the whole world copied. And in return, decade by decade, GM took away its big engines, watered down its models into rebadged corporate clones, cut the corners that burned its best ideas, and then, when the reckoning came, chose it as one of the brands to switch off. There's a hard lesson buried in that white G6. A brand is not its logo, or its factory, or its balance sheet. It's a promise. Pontiac's promise was excitement, and the moment the company decided excitement wasn't worth paying for, the brand was already gone. The 2010 shutdown just made it official. Pontiac built excitement, right up until the company that owned it decided excitement was a cost it could cut, and that, not a rival, not a recession, is what really ended the most exciting brand General Motors ever had.